200 guests watched them strip Adeline Marsh of everything she owned, right there in the ballroom, on what was supposed to be her wedding day. The ring, the handbag, the phone, her last name. Her adoptive father stood up in front of half of Chicago's education board and announced that this woman wasn't part of his family anymore, and not one person in that room asked her a single question about what she'd found upstairs. She was 27 years old. She taught children with special needs in one of the poorest public schools on the South Side, and she walked out through a lobby full of people who couldn't be bothered to lower their phones. The only thing they let her keep was her father's necktie, the one he'd handed her on a Tuesday afternoon, 19 years ago, and never came back for. Then she sat down on the hotel steps and stayed there for 3 hours, while every guest who left that day stepped around her like she was a puddle on the sidewalk. Every single one of them, except a man in a wheelchair. He was 34, in a black shirt buttoned all the way to the wrist, and he didn't offer her money or a ride or any of the soft words people use when they want to feel better about walking away. He said one sentence. Nobody had said anything like it to her all day. And when Adeline Marsh knelt down on that sidewalk and asked a complete stranger to marry her, the whole street laughed. Her ex-fiancé laughed the loudest. Her sister filmed it and passed it around all evening like a joke that kept getting funnier. Not one of them thought to ask who the quiet man in the chair actually was. They should have asked. If stories about dignity, and about the people who see our worth when nobody else will, mean something to you, take a second to hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because we've got a lot more of these coming your way. Now let's go back to those hotel steps in Chicago, and to the woman everybody had already crossed off the list. The old car pulled to the curb before the laughter on the sidewalk had fully faded. And the man who stepped out to open the rear door didn't look at Adeline even once. He looked only at the man in the wheelchair, gave the faintest nod, and stood there waiting. Renzo told her to get in. Throughout the drive from downtown toward the South Side, no one spoke. She sat close to the door, still holding her father's tie in her lap, her thumb moving again and again over the frayed stitching along the inner edge, the same motion she'd made since childhood whenever she didn't know what to do with herself. By the time they reached Bridgeport, night had fallen. The apartment was on the ground floor of an old brick row house, and the kitchen window looked directly into an unlit alley. The man named Warren carried in Renzo's only bag, then stepped back outside, and Adeline noticed that he didn't close the car door or leave the sidewalk. The elderly woman next door heard them arrive and brought over a pot of soup that was still hot, set it on the table, and took bowls from the cupboard as though she'd done this 100 times before. Her name was Delphine Boyd. She looked Adeline over once, didn't ask who she was, and said only that the night was cold and people ought to eat something warm before they started thinking. Then she turned to Renzo, still speaking in the practical voice of someone setting a table, and asked whether next week's medicine had been delivered yet, or whether she should call and remind them again. He told her to call. She nodded, told them to finish the soup, and went home. When the door closed, and only the two of them remained in a room that smelled of old plaster, Renzo told her the part of the truth he'd chosen to reveal. He said his family had money, real money, and he wouldn't pretend otherwise. But after the accident, a family like his could forgive many things, just not a broken object that had once been meant for display. They removed him from every party, every photograph, every telephone call. They gave him a monthly allowance and a quiet street, and in return, he was expected to remain invisible. When he finished, he looked directly at her and said that what she'd just taken for herself was an allowance, an alley without lights, and a man who couldn't rise to greet his own wife. Adeline listened to every word without blinking. Then she asked where the kitchen was. There was almost nothing in the refrigerator, but she found a few eggs, a small piece of butter, and some bread that had gone slightly dry. And with those things she cooked the first supper of their marriage. She placed the plate in front of him and said that her husband wasn't going to bed hungry on their wedding night. He stared at the plate for a long time, then asked the question he'd been holding back for the entire drive. He asked why she'd knelt down. He said she hadn't known his name, hadn't known who he was, and a woman like her didn't kneel before a wheelchair unless she was running away from something or running toward something. She sat in the chair across from him, remained silent for a while, then said that the entire city had looked at her that day as though she were a scandal, as though she were something that had fallen from a pocket and no one could be bothered to pick up. Only he had looked at her as though she were a human being. She said she was 27 years old, and it was the first time in her life anyone had looked at her that way on the very day she needed it most. That night, She slept on the couch in the living room, and the next morning she woke before the sky had fully brightened. She carried a bag of trash toward the back door, and then she stopped. In that dark alley, a line of people stood waiting. An old man in a coat dusted with flour, the owner of the bakery on the corner, held a stack of wrinkled papers in his hands. A young laborer had been cheated out of 3 months' wages by his employer. A mother stood with eyes swollen from crying because her son had been arrested for something she swore he hadn't done. They didn't speak to one another. They simply stood there, silent and patient, the way people waited outside the doors of a church. Warren opened the kitchen door, and one by one, they went inside. No one called Renzo by his name. They called him something else, a word Adeline had to hear 3 times before she understood it clearly. Padrino. And every person who came out of that kitchen stopped before leaving, bent down, and kissed the back of his hand. When the last of them had disappeared at the far end of the alley, she stood in the doorway and looked at him. He told her that the people in this neighborhood had been asking his family for guidance since his grandfather's time, that now he had nothing left to lend them but the family name, and whenever someone came to ask, he listened. She nodded. She poured him a cup of coffee, set it on the table, and didn't ask another question. But from that morning on, she began to count. That night, after every light in the house had gone dark and the traffic on the main road had begun to thin, Adeline opened the door to the shared hallway of the building, lowered herself onto the bottom step, and dialed the telephone number she knew better than her own address. The long-term care center where her younger brother lived was 11 miles to the west, and she'd called there at this hour every night for 7 years, even on nights when she was so exhausted she could barely lift her hand. The nurse on duty recognized her voice before she'd finished half a sentence and said Jonah was still awake, that he wouldn't go to sleep, that he kept staring toward the door. Adeline asked her to turn on the speaker. There were footsteps moving along the hallway at the other end of the line, the soft roll of a hospital bed's wheels, and then silence. She knew her brother was lying there listening. She brought the phone closer to her mouth, and she began to sing. It was the song their mother used to sing, an old song she'd hum while washing dishes in the cramped kitchen of the apartment they'd once rented, a song both children had known before they were old enough to go to school. Adeline's voice wasn't beautiful. She went slightly off-key in the middle, as she always did, and she didn't correct herself, because their mother had always gone off-key in that exact place too. She sang very softly, almost in a whisper, because the hallway carried echoes and because she didn't want anyone in the building to hear. She finished the first verse, then paused for a beat, and in that silence, 2 faint taps sounded against the metal rail of the bed at the other end of the line. She closed her eyes. Then she kept singing until the song was finished. She told him she'd had something to take care of that day and had come home late, that she'd visit tomorrow, that he should go to sleep and stop watching the door. Then she wished him good night and ended the call. She didn't get up right away. She remained there in the dark hallway, both hands resting on her knees, the phone's black screen lying in her palm, and she sat like that for a very long time, not crying, only sitting, until her fingers began to grow cold. Inside the apartment, beyond the half-closed door, Renzo had heard everything from the first ring. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't wheel himself out. He sat in the darkness of the bedroom, facing the wall that separated him from the hallway, and listened to a woman whom the entire city had watched kneel on a sidewalk, sing her younger brother to sleep over the telephone as though that day had never happened. When he heard her rise, he rolled his chair farther back into the room and pretended to be asleep. The next morning, after Adeline had left for the bus stop, Warren arrived as usual, with a stack of papers beneath his arm, and Renzo spoke before the man had even taken his seat. He said he wanted the boy's entire medical bill at the center on the west side paid in full, all at once, and he wanted it done before the end of the week. Warren didn't answer immediately. He placed the papers on the table, pulled out a chair, sat down, and only then spoke. He said a large sum of money appearing from nowhere was never truly from nowhere, that she was a teacher, not a fool, that she'd call the center, ask who had paid, trace it backward, and within a week she'd be standing in front of him with a question he didn't yet know how to answer. Then Warren lowered his voice and added a second thing, the thing he still didn't want to say inside that house. He said that the moment her name became tied to Renzo's money, it would appear on the same list as his, and the person who'd cut the brakes on his car before was still out there, still reading lists like that. Renzo said nothing. He turned the ring on his little finger once, then stopped and lowered his hand. He stared through the kitchen window into the unlit alley for a long while, long enough for Warren to believe he'd abandoned the idea. Then he spoke. He said not to pay the bill. He said to buy him time, not buy him a lie. Warren asked how much time he wanted, and Renzo said as much as it took, so long as the boy didn't have to leave his bed, and so long as his wife never learned why. That night, after Adeline had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, Warren returned. He didn't ring the bell. He simply stood at the back door, and the wheelchair was pushed out of the apartment so quietly that not a single floorboard made a sound. The place they went was only a few blocks away, a bakery that had closed at dusk, its sign dark and the curtains drawn tightly across the front windows. They went around to the rear entrance, through a narrow hallway that still carried the lingering scent of baked flour, and into a back room with a long wooden table and several low-hanging lights. 6 men were already there. They'd arrived long before, and not one of them had taken a seat. They stood with their hands folded in front of them, silent, until the door opened and Warren pushed the wheelchair to the head of the table. Not one man looked down at the chair. That was something Adeline would never have understood had she been there, because throughout that entire day in the hotel lobby, every person's eyes had fallen on the wheelchair before they rose to the face of the man sitting in it. Here, they didn't. Here, 6 grown men looked Renzo directly in the face and waited. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't remove his coat. He placed both hands on the arms of the chair, and he spoke. His voice was low, so low that the man standing at the far end of the table had to lean forward. He named an educational consulting firm, Whitmore & Cole, and said that every contract they held with the city's school districts contained a clause requiring honest records, and that those records hadn't been honest for years. He said that tomorrow, before business opened, the breach provision in the entire contract package was to be activated. He said their lines of credit at 2 banks were to be frozen before sunrise, quietly, without any announcement, and without anyone signing their own name to anything. 4 sentences. When he finished, he fell silent. A man standing near the far end of the table, the youngest among them, cleared his throat and opened his mouth to ask whether Renzo meant every contract or only the largest ones. Warren cut him off before the question was fully spoken. He said Renzo didn't speak twice. The younger man closed his mouth, gave a single nod, and no one in the room looked at him again. Renzo offered no further explanation. He didn't say why. He didn't say who stood behind the company. He didn't mention what had happened in a hotel lobby that afternoon. The 6 men in the room didn't ask. Warren turned the chair around, and they had nearly reached the door when Renzo raised one hand and lightly stopped the wheel. He turned his head and looked across the entire room. He said there was one more thing. He said there was a man named Trevor Blake, and no one was to touch him. No one. Not today, not next month, not in some alley after he staggered home drunk. He said that if anyone disobeyed, he wouldn't punish Trevor. He would punish the man who disobeyed. Then he added one more sentence, and it was the only sentence that night in which his voice carried something different. He said his wife was a teacher, that she taught children, and that she hadn't married him to become the wife of a man with blood on his hands. All 6 men nodded together, and no one spoke. The wheelchair passed through the back door, through the narrow hallway that still smelled of baked flour, and disappeared into the dark street. The next morning, Gerald Whitmore woke in his large house on the north side of the city to the sound of the telephone ringing before 6 o'clock. The first caller was the head of his company's legal department, his voice unsteady, as he said that emails had arrived from 3 school districts at the same time, all using the same wording and citing the same clause. The second caller was the manager of his bank branch, a man who'd sat beside him at charity dinners for years, and this time he spoke very briefly. He said the credit lines had been suspended, that he wasn't permitted to explain further, and that he was sorry. Deborah Whitmore stood at the top of the staircase in her robe and asked her husband what was happening. Gerald didn't answer. He called 3 more people, men he'd trusted all his life to settle anything with a single telephone call, and all 3 answered. All 3 listened, and all 3 said the same thing in different ways, that they didn't know who had given the order, and that they didn't want to know. While the telephone in the Whitmore house rang without pause, Adeline stood in her classroom on the south side of the city, with a box of colored pencils in her hands, knowing nothing at all about what was happening. Her class had 9 students, and no 2 of them were alike. One could read more fluently than anyone in the classroom next door, but couldn't remain seated for more than 10 minutes. Another could recite the exact order of every train station in the entire city. And then there was Micah, The boy who sat at the first desk, to the left of the window. The boy who communicated in his own way. Micah spoke with his eyes, by taking her hand and leading her toward whatever he wanted, and through the plastic blocks he arranged in long rows across his desk, according to an order only he understood, red blocks beside red blocks, blue blocks beside blue blocks, and one perfectly straight line meant it was going to be a good day. In the 2 years Adeline had taught him, Micah hadn't used words. He still laughed, still had a best friend in the little girl who sat behind him and drew dinosaurs, still heard the entire class call his name every morning, and still returned their greeting by opening and closing his hand. Adeline had never rushed him. She simply sat beside his desk for a little while each day, said his name, waited, and then told him what the day would bring, as though he'd already answered her. That afternoon, she was exhausted. She'd taught all day, hurried back and forth between 2 rooms, eaten nothing since morning, and when the final bell rang, she sat down at her desk, folded her arms, and lowered her head while the children were still packing their school bags. She meant only to close her eyes for a moment. Then she felt a small hand rest on her shoulder. She looked up. Micah was standing beside the desk, his hand still on her shoulder, looking directly into her face, and he said her name. The entire classroom fell silent for one heartbeat, then erupted. The little girl who drew dinosaurs cried out with delight. The 2 children at the back of the room sprang to their feet and began clapping, and someone shouted, "Miss! Miss!" He spoke, while Micah, surrounded by all that noise, simply smiled the way a child smiles after doing something he knows matters. Adeline stood, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. I heard you clearly." The whole class applauded once more simply because it felt good. Outside in the hallway, a man in a wheelchair had stopped before the glass panel in the door and had seen everything. Renzo had arrived to pick her up earlier than they had agreed. He didn't knock and didn't enter. He remained there until all the children had gone, then wheeled himself back out of sight and waited at the far end of the hallway, as though he'd only just arrived. On her way out, Adeline passed the teacher's lounge, where the school's donor list still hung on the wall as it had for years, the paper faded and its corners curling. She walked past it, as she did every day without looking. In the car, he asked how school had been, and she told him about Micah, speaking without pause, her eyes bright, and it was the first time since their wedding that he'd heard her say so much. But that afternoon had another side to it. She stopped at the care center, and the woman at the reception desk told her that Jonah's file had just been moved into the category of financial sponsorship under review, which meant he wouldn't have to leave, though the monthly payment would still have to be made as usual until a decision was reached. Adeline thanked her, nodded, and kept her expression unchanged until she was outside. She'd sold her wedding dress the week before to a second-hand shop on Halsted Street, and that money had already gone where it needed to go. She sat in the old car in the supermarket parking lot, opened her wallet, counted what remained, counted it twice, and knew it wouldn't last through the end of the week. She called the center and asked whether she could delay a small part of the payment. The person on the other end was a young woman, and she wasn't harsh with her at all. She said, "It's all right, ma'am. Many families are in the same position. Take the time you need, and I'll make a note for you." It was that kindness that broke her. Adeline ended the call, bent over the steering wheel, and cried, truly cried, like someone who'd held it inside for far too long, sitting in a car parked beneath the tall floodlights of a supermarket lot. She cried for several minutes, then she sat upright, wiped her face with the back of her hand, tilted down the rearview mirror and studied herself once, stepped out of the car, and went into the supermarket to buy food for dinner. When she placed the plate on the table, Renzo asked how her day had been. She said it had been ordinary. That night, after the dishes had been cleared away, and Adeline had lain down on the couch in the living room, she heard a sound from the bedroom. At first, she thought he was turning over. Then she heard it again. It wasn't the sound of someone shifting in bed. It was the sound of breath being held back. The sound of a man trying with all his strength not to make a noise. And between those strained breaths was something she'd heard only once before in her life. When she'd sat in the hospital hallway, the year her younger brother was first admitted. She sat up, walked to the bedroom door, and raised her hand to knock, then stopped. She stood there for a long time, her hand still suspended in the air, and she realized he was biting down on the pillow. She realized he hadn't begun doing it that night, but had done it through countless nights before, including all the nights before she'd ever entered his home. She lowered her hand, returned to the couch, and lay awake staring at the ceiling until morning. The next day was Saturday. She left the house early without saying where she was going, leaving only a note on the table saying she had something to do and would be home before dinner. She took the bus to Halsted Street and went to a rehabilitation clinic, wedged between a laundromat and a pharmacy, where the windows were covered with flyers and the waiting room was always crowded. She stood in line, and when her turn came, she told the woman at the desk that she wasn't there for treatment. She said she wanted to learn. They told her there were no classes there. She said she knew that she wasn't asking for a class, only for permission to watch. She said her husband had been burned many years ago, that his legs hurt at night, and that she couldn't afford to hire anyone to come to their home, so she wanted to learn with her own hands. The woman behind the desk looked her over, then went into the back. About 15 minutes later, an older doctor came out, more than half his hair already gray, his sleeves rolled high. He asked her several questions about the burns, where they were, and what time of day the pain usually came, and she answered every one of them, because she'd spent so many nights listening without ever realizing she was remembering. He nodded, told her to wash her hands, then asked her to follow him into the treatment room. She remained on her feet for the entire day. He showed her how to place her hands along the bands of scar tissue, how to feel for the places where the tissue beneath had adhered, how to press in the direction of the fibers instead of across them, and how to use the strength from her shoulders rather than her wrists, because her wrists would give out before the patient found relief. He let her practice on his own arm, then on an elderly patient who agreed to let her work under his supervision. He told her that during the first few days, the patient would hurt more rather than feel better, that this was normal, and that she had to prepare herself not to stop halfway through. At the end of the afternoon, while she was drying her hands and preparing to leave, he told her one more thing in the same voice he used when teaching his students their profession. He said that people who lived with pain for many years often developed a habit of locking themselves away. He said they didn't want anyone to see them, that they believed they were being kind to the people they loved, and that they were wrong. He said that if she ever came home and found a locked door with silence behind it, she must never leave him alone in there. She thanked him and asked how much she owed. He waved the question away and said that when she came back the following week, she could bring him a loaf of bread from the bakery on the corner. By the time she returned home, night had fully fallen. Renzo was sitting in the living room, and there was something on his face she'd never seen before, something like the expression of a man who'd spent hours counting every sound on the staircase. Before he could ask where she'd been, she walked straight into the bedroom, pulled down the blanket, and told him to lie on his stomach. He asked what she intended to do. She handed him the pillow and told him to bite down on it because the beginning was going to hurt. When her hands settled over the scarred place and pressed down exactly as she'd been taught throughout the day, his entire body went still. He turned his head to look at her and asked who had taught her to do that. She didn't stop moving her hands. She said that was where his wife, the one who'd left the house for the entire day, had been. The invitation was delivered to the apartment one afternoon in the middle of the week, and Warren placed it on the table without saying anything more than that the old lady had warned him that if her grandson didn't attend, she would come to Bridgeport herself and sit on the sidewalk until the neighbors were forced to ask what was wrong. Every year, the Castellano Family Foundation held a fundraising gala, and that year the proceeds were to go to the city's children's library. Renzo looked at the invitation for a long time, then told his wife that it was time for her to see the family that had cast him aside. What he didn't tell her was that the Whitmores had also purchased tickets through an acquaintance of an acquaintance, because when a man's company was slowly dying, he would pay any price to stand in the same room as names that were still alive. That evening, when the car stopped before the brightly lit steps, 2 attendants approached to help push the wheelchair, and Adeline shook her head. She placed her own hands on the handles of her husband's chair and pushed him inside herself, through the foyer, through the crowd, beneath the gaze of everyone in the room. A murmur rose near the wine table, loud enough for her to hear, and a woman's voice asked whether this family could no longer afford even someone to push a wheelchair. Adeline stopped, turned toward her, and said in the most ordinary voice that gold held in one's own hands couldn't be snatched away, "Ma'am." Then she continued walking. At the far end of the room, seated in a high-backed chair with armrests like a small throne, was Rosaria Castellano. She was past 80, her back still perfectly straight, and when Renzo was brought before her, the entire room seemed to lower its voice. She looked her grandson over once, then turned her eyes to Adeline, and she didn't soften her voice in the slightest. She asked whether this was the public school teacher whose video the whole city had been passing from hand to hand. She said the Castellano name had stood in that city since the days of her husband's grandfather, that some people waited months for the privilege of sitting at the same table as this family, and yet her grandson had picked up a woman from a hotel sidewalk, a woman whose own blood relatives had publicly disowned her before a crowd. She said she didn't know whether she ought to feel pity or shame. She said that at least before this, the family had only one disgrace, but now it had two, and the second disgrace could walk and speak. Somewhere behind them, someone laughed softly. Adeline didn't blush. She didn't argue a single word in defense of herself. She merely stepped half a pace forward, placed herself between the old woman and the wheelchair, and said Rosaria could speak about her as much as she pleased, because she'd heard crueler things from the very people who had once fed her. But she said Rosaria would not stand in that room and speak of her husband as though he were a disgrace. She said the man his family supported with an allowance and hid in an unlit alley was the same man an entire neighborhood lined up to see at his kitchen door before sunrise. She said his family had thrown him away, and on the day they did, they also surrendered the right to feel ashamed of him. Rosaria stared at her for a long time without another word, then turned her face away and told a servant to bring her a glass of water. Adeline pushed her husband toward the windows. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 hands touched her elbows. Gerald and Deborah Whitmore stood beside her, both smiling, both speaking softly as they drew her into a corner of the room near the curtains. Deborah called her daughter. It was the first time in 19 years that she'd called her that. Gerald said some unseen shadow was tightening around the throat of his company, that no one knew its face or its name, that he'd called everyone he'd ever relied upon, and none of them dared answer the telephone a second time. He said that now she was inside this family, even if only through their broken son. She had to find a way to meet the person responsible and kneel before him if necessary, because a daughter's tears might move what money couldn't. Adeline listened to every word. Then she said he'd disowned her in front of 200 people, had sent someone to take back the handbag she was holding, and now he was standing at a party asking her to kneel on his behalf. She said she wouldn't do it. Deborah began to cry, and Gerald seized Adeline by the wrist. She removed his hand and walked toward the hallway. There, leaning against the wall just beyond the turn, Trevor Blake was waiting for her with 2 glasses of wine in his hands. He said he'd been wrong. He said he'd been a fool. He said Camille was a spider, and Adeline knew that better than anyone. Then he lowered his voice and said what he'd truly come there to say. He said the Castellanos had money, that even their broken son had to have something in his name, and that she was inside the house now, with access to signatures and trust. He said she only had to move a little of it outside, enough for the 2 of them to begin again, and then return to him as before. Adeline looked him over from head to toe, and said the man he'd just called broken had more backbone sitting in a chair than Trevor had standing upright. Then she walked past him, returned to the great hall, went to the wheelchair, and placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. The lights in the great hall were lowered, and the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and announced that the next part of the evening was dedicated to a young woman whose name the entire city had heard. Camille Whitmore walked onto the stage to applause, holding the children's book that had placed her on the cover of a magazine the previous spring, the story of a little girl who carried a lantern through a town that had lost all its electricity. She thanked the foundation, thanked the family, and spoke for a few moments about how a story could save a child. Then she opened the book and began to read. In the back row, Adeline sat motionless, listening to every word with both hands resting on her knees, and Renzo was the only person in the room who saw her knuckles slowly turn white. Camille finished the final passage, closed the book, and bowed. The room erupted in applause, and in the middle of that applause, Adeline stood. She didn't raise her voice, but the hall carried an echo, and she said that the story they had just heard had been stolen, and that the woman who had just bowed was the person who had taken it. The applause died at once. Someone gave a short laugh, then fell silent. Camille remained on the stage, her smile still perfectly in place, and said she was terribly sorry, that her adoptive older sister had been through a difficult month and perhaps ought to sit down. Adeline didn't sit. She said the book had only a beginning and a middle, that it ended with the little girl relighting her lantern and the whole town becoming bright again, and that anyone who had ever written a story knew that wasn't an ending. It was simply the place where someone stopped writing, because there was nothing left to copy. She said the original story had one more section, and that section had never been printed because the final pages of the handwritten manuscript had been torn away before it ever reached anyone else's hands. Then she began to recite it. She stood in the middle of the hall without holding a page, without looking at anyone, and spoke from memory the part that no one in that room had ever heard. It was the part where the little girl realized that her own lantern wasn't bright enough for the entire town. So she went from house to house, knocking on every door and using her flame to light each lamp one by one, and in the end, her own lantern ran dry and went dark, but the whole street was shining. Adeline finished the passage in the same steady voice, and when she stopped, not a sound could be heard anywhere in the room. Camille stood on the stage, and for the first time that evening, her smile was no longer sitting where it belonged. Then came the sharp sound of a cane striking the wooden floor. Rosaria Castellano rose from the high-backed chair at the far end of the hall, and the servant walking behind her carried a flat box. She moved slowly toward the center of the room and placed the box on the table beneath the lights. Inside was a bundle of yellowed pages tied with string, written in pencil in the hand of a child, the letters large and slanted, with places that had been erased and written again. She said she'd bought those papers many years before from someone who had once worked at a children's home in Rockford, that they had been sold with a box of old belongings and no one had known what they were. She said she'd kept them because she liked things written by children. Then she turned to the final pages and read aloud the exact passage Adeline had just recited from memory, word for word, without making a single mistake. She closed the bundle and told the entire hall that the first page bore the name of the child who had written it, and that name wasn't Whitmore. Camille stepped down from the stage. She said nothing. Her face drained white, and as she passed the display stand holding her book, she struck it with one hand and sent it crashing to the floor, the book and the stand falling together with a sound that echoed across the room. Then she lunged toward Adeline. Adeline didn't step back. She reached out, caught her adoptive sister by the wrist, and held it tightly. Then she spoke close to Camille's face, quietly enough that only the two of them could hear, but clearly enough for everyone in the room to see her lips moving. She said Camille had just raised her hand in front of 200 people and was still standing, and that was all the mercy she would ever receive from Adeline in this life. Then she released her. Members of the foundation came forward and escorted Camille from the room, while at the far end of the hall, Gerald Whitmore struggled to pull his wife up from her chair. Deborah didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on the yellowed manuscript, lying on the table as though she were staring at something she'd always known would one day return. Rosaria didn't watch anyone leave. She turned toward Adeline. She removed the ring from her own finger, the ring every woman in the room recognized at once, and took the hand of the public school teacher whom, less than an hour earlier, she'd called the family's second disgrace. She said the ring had entered the Castellano family before the streets of that city had names, that it wasn't meant for the richest woman or the most beautiful one, but for the woman with the strongest hands. Then she placed it on Adeline's finger in the middle of the hall, before everyone, and she didn't offer a single word of explanation. On the way back to Bridgeport, Renzo didn't say a single word. Adeline thought he was tired. She talked about the ring, about the old woman, about the way the entire room had fallen silent, and he only nodded, his eyes fixed beyond the window. By the time they were halfway home, she realized his hand was gripping the arm of the wheelchair more tightly than usual. The moment they reached the apartment, he pushed himself into the bedroom before she could even remove her coat. Then she heard the lock slide into place. She stopped in the middle of the living room, still holding the keys in her hand. She walked to the door, knocked, called his name, and asked whether he was all right. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time, and the room beyond remained silent. It wasn't the silence of someone sleeping. It was the silence of a man using every ounce of strength not to make a sound. The silence she'd heard through the wall for so many nights, without ever daring to give it a name. And she remembered the words of the gray-haired doctor on Halsted Street, the words he'd spoken at the end of that afternoon in the most ordinary voice of professional advice. She stopped knocking. She lowered herself onto the hallway floor, with her back against the wooden door, drew her knees up, and began to speak. She said she wasn't going anywhere, that he could leave the door locked if he needed to, but she would sit there until morning if that was what it took. Then she told him. She told him about the night her mother died. She said she'd been 9 years old, that they had taken her mother away while it was still dark, that the Whitmores had brought the 2 children into their home only a year earlier, and that they had warned her no one in that house was allowed to make a scene. She said that night she'd gone into the bathroom at the end of the second-floor hallway, the only room in the house with a lock on the inside, fastened it, turned the faucet on as loudly as it would go, and sat on the tiled floor crying until she had no breath left, because she was afraid that if anyone heard her, they would think she was a troublesome child and send her back. She said she'd done the same thing for years. Whenever something happened, she went into that room, locked the door, and turned on the water. She said she understood perfectly what it felt like to believe you were being kind to other people by locking yourself away. She said she'd believed that too, until the day her younger brother was in the hospital and she sat alone in the hallway all night, and she realized that the person outside the door was suffering just as much, only suffering alone. Her voice remained steady. She didn't cry, and she didn't plead. She spoke for nearly an hour, sometimes falling silent for long stretches, sometimes saying only a few words, and she didn't know whether he could hear her inside. Then the lock slid back. The door opened, and Renzo was sitting directly behind it, leaning forward, his face wet with sweat, looking at her like a man who had been swimming for a very long time through freezing water. He told her the pain came at night, almost every night, and that it had been coming that way for 6 years. He said that during the first years, he still screamed, and the people in the great house heard him, and he saw their faces at breakfast the next morning, and those expressions were harder to endure than the pain itself. He said that after that, he'd learned to close the door. He said he'd told himself he was doing it so no one else would have to listen, and until that night, he'd still believed it. Adeline didn't rise. She sat on the floor directly in front of him, placed both hands on his knees, and said that from that night forward, there would be one law in that house. No door would ever be closed between the two of them again. Not one, not for any reason. She said the pain would still come. She knew that, and she wasn't making him any promises about it. But from then on, whenever it came, it would have to face 2 people instead of 1, and she'd fought things larger than that with far less. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against her hands, and for a very long time, he said nothing. Then he asked whether she was tired. She said she was. He said, "Then come inside. Don't sleep on the couch anymore." It happened on a weekend evening, when Adeline came home later than expected after taking bread to the doctor on Halsted Street. Warren wasn't at the front door as he usually was, so she went around to the back and entered through the kitchen. From the hallway, she heard voices coming from the room behind the bakery, and she stopped in the doorway. Inside stood a man of about 50, his hair neatly combed and his coat expensive, and he was crying. He cried like a man who knew his tears were the only thing he had left to offer. He said he would pay. He said he only needed more time. He said some investments had gone badly. He said this was a matter of business, not deception. Everyone in the neighborhood had heard his name. He was the man who had taken the retirement money of 3 families living in the last few blocks of the street and promised them returns no one could possibly promise. Renzo sat at the head of the table with both hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. He didn't raise his voice. He showed no anger at all. He allowed the man to say everything he had to say until he had emptied himself of words, and only then did Renzo ask a single question. He asked whether the man had ever thought about the elderly woman in the first apartment of the row, the woman nearly 80 years old, whom he had stripped of everything. Not whether he had thought about her after he was discovered. Whether he had thought about her when he sat in his car on the street below and rang her doorbell for the first time. The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't answer. The entire room remained silent for several breaths. Then Renzo raised one hand, turned the ring on his little finger exactly twice, and gave Warren a single nod. That was all. No one rose. No one touched the man. There wasn't a sound louder than the scrape of a chair moving across the floor. They escorted him to the door, and he walked out on his own. Over the following 2 days, the house in his name was seized under the exact terms of the mortgage agreement he himself had signed. His car was repossessed for missed payments, his accounts were frozen after 3 petitions were filed on the same morning, and his financial advisory license was suspended after the board received a file no one knew who had sent. Everything was done within the law. Not a single signature was missing, and the name Castellano appeared nowhere. Adeline had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched everything from beginning to end. That night, she said nothing. The next morning, she placed a cup of coffee in front of her husband and asked him who he was. Renzo didn't ask what she had seen. He didn't explain, didn't defend himself, and didn't say a single word to soften what had happened the night before. He only told her to get her coat. Warren drove them to a cemetery on the northwest side of the city, and Adeline pushed Renzo herself along the stone path until they stopped before a grave bearing his father's name. He sat in silence for a while before he began to speak. He said his father had led the family before him, He said there was one thing his father had forbidden absolutely, something he'd forbidden since he was still a very young man, even when others told him he was turning away from the deepest current of money. He said his father had upheld that prohibition for the rest of his life, and that he'd died because of it one evening while returning home, though people had called it a robbery gone wrong. Renzo said he'd been very young then, younger than she was now, and they had placed him in that chair of authority because there was no one else left who carried the family name. He said he'd kept his father's prohibition exactly as it was, without loosening it even slightly, even when people within his own house told him that the times had changed. Then he spoke about the night on the overpass. He said it hadn't been an accident. He said the car had been prepared before he ever climbed into it. Then he remained silent for a long time, and at last he told her the thing he'd hidden longest, the thing even Warren had heard him say only once. He said that after 6 years, he still didn't know who had given the order. He said he knew only one thing for certain, that the person had sat at the same table with him during holidays, that the person might even have embraced him at his father's funeral. He said that was why he'd left the great house, left every party, and sat quietly in an unlit alley for 6 years, listening. When he finished, he turned his wheelchair and looked directly into her face. He said she now knew everything she needed to know, and he wouldn't ask her to stay. He said that very afternoon he could have papers drawn up, that she could leave with half of everything he owned, that no one would trouble her, no one would come looking for her, and she could take her younger brother anywhere she wished in the entire country. Adeline listened to all of it. Then she said she wasn't taking half. She said what she was taking was the line his father had drawn, the line Renzo hadn't crossed once in 6 years. She said that from then on, she would stand on that line beside him, and if the day ever came when he meant to cross it, the first person he would have to cross would be her. The cold came early that season, and one Sunday afternoon, while Renzo was out with Warren, Adeline decided to straighten the wardrobe in the bedroom, something she should have done long before. The closet was nearly empty. A few dark shirts hung at even intervals, along with 2 sweaters and a pair of shoes that had never been worn. She took down the coat hanging farthest inside so she could wash it, and when she draped it over her arm, she heard paper rustling in the inner pocket. She pulled out a thick brown envelope, its folds still crisp, its sealed edge never opened. She sat on the side of the bed and opened it. Inside were photographs. They had been taken from a distance, in parking lots and outside the entrance of a building, and the people in those photographs were Trevor Blake and Camille Whitmore. Beneath the photographs were copies of financial statements, transfer records marked with yellow ink, sums of money leaving an account in her name and entering an account belonging to Gerald's company. At the upper corner of the first page, there was a date, the day before her wedding. She sat motionless for a long time with the papers resting in her lap. Then she set them down and reached into the deepest drawer of the wardrobe for the box she had intended to clear out next. Inside that small wooden box was only one thing, a silver St. Christopher medallion, its back worn almost smooth, its chain broken in one place and repaired with a ring of a different color. Adeline knew that repair. Her mother had made it herself with a ring taken from a broken necklace when Adeline was still a child, and she used to joke that the saint now walked on 2 different legs. Adeline sat on the bedroom floor with the medallion in her palm until she heard a key turning in the front door. When Renzo was pushed into the room, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, the papers placed to her left, and the wooden box open to her right. He saw them both, and he couldn't speak. Adeline asked the first question. She asked whether he knew who the medallion belonged to. He said he did. He said that for 6 years, that was all he'd known, and he hadn't known anything more. Then she told him. She said she'd been 21 that winter, working the night shift at a diner, and that evening the last bus had left her at the beginning of the overpass, forcing her to walk. She said there had been a car ahead of her that had struck the barrier and burst into flames, that people had stopped and formed a circle around it, and that no one moved closer because everyone knew what might happen. She said she'd heard someone inside, and she hadn't made any decision at all. Her legs had simply carried her forward. She said the man had been much heavier than she was, that she'd dragged him by his collar and by his arms, that her hands had slipped after a short distance, and that she'd pulled again, screaming as she dragged him, until 2 men finally ran forward to help her. She said that when they laid him on the pavement, his eyes were still open, and she'd taken off her mother's medallion, pressed it into his palm, and told him to hold on to it, because she didn't know what else she could give him to hold on to. She said she'd believed it had been lost that night. She said she'd mourned it for an entire year, Renzo listened to everything without interrupting her once. And when she stopped, he said he'd spent 6 years looking for her. He said he'd awakened after one surgery after another, and the only thing he could remember was a face bending over him against a wall of fire. He said he'd sent men to question everyone who'd been on the overpass that night, and all they had ever brought back was a name from the employee badge of a diner that had since closed. He said that by the time they finally found her, she was already wearing another man's ring. Then he looked down at the papers lying on the bed. He said he'd carried that envelope with him to the hotel that day. He said he'd gone there to stop the wedding. He said he'd sat in the lobby for nearly 3 hours, from the time the staff were still arranging the flowers, counting every person who passed him, and each time he considered asking someone to take the envelope upstairs. He imagined her opening it in the middle of her wedding day, looking up to see who had sent it, and finding a man in a wheelchair sitting at the far end of the lobby. He said he'd feared that look more than anything else in his life. He said he'd been a coward for almost exactly 3 hours, and that if he'd given her the envelope sooner, she wouldn't have had to walk into that room. Adeline shook her head. She said that if he'd given it to her at 10 o'clock that morning, she would have believed he was trying to ruin the wedding, and she would have married Trevor anyway. She said she hadn't needed anyone to save her from that day. She said what she'd needed was someone who would remain seated after everything had burned away. And in that entire hotel lobby, there had been only one person who didn't stand up and leave. The message arrived in the middle of the week through Uncle Bruno, Renzo's father's younger brother and the only person in the great house who still called him by his childhood name. Bruno said the 5 families from across the region would meet on Friday evening at a restaurant in Cicero that had closed for the winter, that it was their customary gathering held once every 2 years, and that if the chair bearing the Castellano name remained empty one more time, people would no longer assume its occupant was busy. They would assume there was no one left to sit in it. He spoke very kindly. He told his nephew to think it over, that no one was forcing him, and that he was only afraid people might begin to talk. Warren put down the telephone and said plainly that it was a trap, that all 5 families knew Renzo couldn't stand, and wanted to see it with their own eyes so they could put their minds at ease. Renzo said he knew. Then he told Warren to prepare the car. On Friday evening, when the wheelchair was pushed through the wooden doors of the private dining room, everyone present had already taken their seats. 4 round tables had been joined to form a circle, with each family occupying one direction, while the chair in the remaining direction had already been removed, deliberately, leaving an empty space exactly wide enough for a wheelchair. No one rose to greet him. Bruno sat directly behind his nephew's place, both hands resting on the table, his face wearing the precise expression of a concerned uncle. The first to speak was the old man from the Western family, the eldest person in the room, with white hair and a voice roughened by cigarettes. He said it had been far too long since they'd seen the young man's face. Then he laughed, stood, walked around behind Renzo, placed his hands on the wheelchair handles, and pushed him out of his place, rolling him into the center of the circle of tables, into the open space in the middle of the floor. Before letting go, the whole room laughed. He said that with Renzo sitting in the middle, everyone could see him, and surely that was more convenient. Warren stepped forward. Renzo didn't turn his head. He merely lifted 2 fingers from the arm of the chair, and Warren stopped where he was, stepped back, and stood still. The laughter slowly faded because no one answered it. Renzo remained in the center of the room. He didn't roll back to his place, straighten his coat, or show the slightest discomfort. He looked around the circle once, and then he began to speak. He told the old man from the West that the Wisconsin house registered in the name of his late cousin had received a new roof the previous summer, and that the roofer who had done the work had later spoken with 2 men in plain clothes at a roadside diner. The old man stopped smiling. Renzo turned toward the northern family, named a warehouse near the docks, named the month in which fewer goods had left the building than had entered it, and said their accountant had known about it before they had. He spoke to the eastern family about the money their son-in-law owed at a casino outside the state. He didn't mention the amount. He only said it was greater than the man had dared admit at home. He spoke to the 4th family about a name, only one name, the name of a man they'd trusted for years, and the man seated in that direction turned pale and couldn't speak. Renzo hadn't brought a single sheet of paper. He didn't look down, hesitate, or repeat himself. By the time he finished, no one in the room was looking down at the wheelchair anymore. Every one of them was looking directly into his face. He said that for 6 years they had believed he was sleeping. He said men who stood did the talking, while men who sat did the listening, and he'd been sitting for a very long time. Then he placed both hands on the wheel rims and rolled himself back toward his place, crossing the empty floor in the center of the table slowly, the sound of the wheels clearly audible throughout the room. No one stood to help him. No one dared. When he reached his side of the circle, he pushed the empty chair aside and guided his wheelchair into the exact space they had deliberately left open to humiliate him. Then he placed both hands on the table like every other man there. Bruno sat directly behind him, and for the rest of the evening, he didn't say another word. Less than 2 weeks after the meeting in Cicero, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, someone began pounding on the door outside the living room. Adeline woke first, and when she opened it, Warren was standing there with dew still dampening his coat, and he walked straight past her into the bedroom without offering a single word of apology. He said Bruno had met privately with 3 of the other 4 families since Tuesday, that he was testing whether enough men would nod their agreement to force a vote, that the Eastern family had refused that night, and so he still didn't have enough, but he wouldn't stop. Then Warren paused and addressed Renzo with the very word Adeline had half heard in the alley that morning and had waited so many months to hear clearly. He called him Padrino. No one in the room said anything else. Adeline stood in the doorway, barefoot on the cold floor, and she didn't ask Warren a single question. She waited until he had gone, then turned on the light, and Renzo told her everything. He said the monthly allowance was a lie. He said the apartment belonged to him. He said the entire row of buildings belonged to him, and so did the whole street, and the bakery on the corner as well. He said Delphine Boyd wasn't a neighbor. She had worked for him since before he moved there, managing everything that entered and left the apartment, and she received a salary from him, just as the couple upstairs did, just as the man who always sat repairing cars at the end of the alley did. He said he wasn't the man his family had cast aside. He was the head of that family, and he'd held that position since he was very young. Then he told her the final thing, the one he found hardest to say. He said Jonah's file had been moved into the category of financial sponsorship under review because of him. He said he'd wanted to pay everything at once, but he'd been stopped, so all he'd been able to buy was time. Adeline listened without interrupting. Then she asked him one question. She didn't ask who he was. She asked how much longer he'd intended to leave her guessing. She said she'd been counting since that morning in the alley, counting every person who stood in line, every telephone call in the middle of the night, every time Warren paused before calling him by name. Then her voice broke, and it wasn't because of the money. She said she'd sold her wedding dress to a second-hand shop on Halsted Street. She said she'd sat in the car in the supermarket parking lot, counting the money she had left again and again, knowing it wouldn't last through the week. She said she'd begged to learn without charge at a clinic, so she could massage with her own hands a man who owned entire hospitals. She said that through all those months, he'd sat in the darkness and watched her love him, watched from beginning to end, as though he were sitting through an audition. She asked whether she'd performed well. Renzo didn't deny a single word. He said yes, it had been a test, but the person being tested had been him, not her. He said that from the time he was very young, every woman who sat across from him had been counting something behind her eyes, and he'd learned to recognize it before she ever opened her mouth. He said it had become worse after the night on the overpass, because from then on, people looked at him and saw 2 things, a name and a wheelchair, never the third thing. He said 6 years in that chair had taught him that the man named Renzo had been swallowed whole by the Castellano name, and that no one left in the world could see him anymore. Then he said that had remained true until the afternoon, when a penniless schoolteacher knelt on the sidewalk before a man she believed had nothing. He said he hadn't kept silent to trap her. He'd kept silent because, for the first time in his life, someone had seen him, and he was terrified that the moment money entered the room, that man would disappear once again. Adeline didn't answer. She went into the bedroom, took her coat and her cloth bag, and walked out before dawn. For the next 3 days, she slept in the vinyl chair beside her brother's bed at the center on the west side. During the day, she continued teaching, and every evening she returned there, while the night nurse asked no questions and simply brought her another blanket. She didn't call Renzo. He didn't call her either, and only later did she learn that he'd sat in his car in the center's parking lot through all 3 of those nights without going inside. On the 3rd night, after she'd turned off the light and curled up on the chair, 2 soft taps sounded against the metal bed rail in the darkness. She lay still for a long time, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, she kissed her brother's forehead, told him to finish his breakfast, then went outside and got into the car. She didn't drive back to Bridgeport. She drove to Halsted Street, sat in the clinic until the gray-haired doctor had finished with his last patient, and asked whether there was anyone left in the world who could do more than what he had already taught her. He sat down and remained silent for a long time, then said there was one name, though he spoke it with the expression of a man who knew he was about to be laughed at. He told her about a rehabilitation physician in Vermont who, many years earlier, had been struck from professional boards because her methods were considered too severe, a woman who had abandoned everything and opened a small center among the hills, and who since then had accepted only factory workers, loggers, farmers, people whose bodies had been partly taken from them by machines. He said she treated them without charging a thing, and that she drove wealthy people straight back through the gate. Adeline left that very night. She drove through the darkness in the old car, stopping twice for gasoline, and arrived while frost still lay white across the grass. The center was nothing more than a row of low wooden buildings surrounding a dirt courtyard. The woman who came out to meet her was past 70, her hair tied neatly back, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and before Adeline had finished her second sentence, she asked what her husband did for a living. Adeline told the truth. The old woman turned her back and walked inside. Adeline followed, speaking toward her back, saying she hadn't come there to buy anything, that she had only come to ask whether there was a way. The woman stopped on the steps, turned, looked her over from head to toe, and named her price. 3 days. 3 days working as the lowest assistant in the center, cleaning patient rooms, changing bed linens, pushing chairs for those who couldn't push themselves, feeding people whose hands had forgotten how to hold a spoon, sleeping on a folding chair in the hallway, and never touching a telephone. She said that if Adeline mentioned money once during those 3 days, only once, she would be outside the gate before she had finished the sentence. Adeline removed her coat and asked where the clean linens were kept. Renzo arrived on the 3rd day. He found the place in his own way, and when he reached the middle of the courtyard, he saw his wife sitting on the steps beside an old man, her left hand supporting his back while her right hand guided a spoon to his mouth. When she stood and walked toward him, he saw her hands. The skin across her knuckles had split from cold water and industrial soap, and several places were raw. He became furious. Right there in the courtyard, he said it ended now, that he would build the old woman a center 10 times larger than this one anywhere she chose, that she only had to name her price, and they could put an end to the game. The old woman was standing on the porch. She didn't raise her voice. She asked how many hospitals he had been through in 6 years. He didn't answer. She asked another question, asking how many of his toes had been healed by 6 years of pride. Then she came down into the courtyard, stood in front of him, and said there was only one question in that place. She pointed toward Adeline's hands. She asked whether his pride weighed more than her blood. Renzo remained silent for a very long time. Then he said no. He said nothing he possessed weighed more than she did. The old woman gave a single nod, then told him the truth before he had time to feel hope. She said the fire had killed the pathways in his legs but hadn't destroyed all of their roots, that those roots were still asleep, and what was asleep could be awakened, but no one else could awaken them for him. She said 14 weeks. 14 weeks there, every day, without missing a single session, and she warned him that during the first weeks he would hurt more than he had before arriving, that there would be days when he would want to leave, and that she wouldn't stop him if he chose to go. He asked what the odds were. She said she wasn't a salesman and had no number to give him. All she had was a courtyard, a horizontal bar, and 14 weeks. He stayed. Adeline returned to Chicago 1 week later so she could be there for the new school week. And during the weeks that followed, while her husband remained in Vermont, she quietly met in private with each person from the other 4 families. By the 9th week, Renzo could stand. He couldn't walk. Not yet. But he could stand with 2 braces fitted around his lower legs, and both hands gripping the parallel bars in the courtyard. And after only a few breaths, sweat was already running from his chin. The old woman counted aloud while he stood, and when he sat down again, she merely said that today was a little better than yesterday, then walked away. Adeline drove up on Friday afternoons after teaching, stayed through the weekend, then returned home. That night was a Saturday in the middle of the month. The wind was strong, and the center stood at the end of a dirt road, nearly half an hour from the nearest town. The electricity went out sometime after midnight. It didn't flicker the way it did on stormy nights. It went out once, completely and decisively, and the backup generator didn't start. Adeline woke because of the silence, because the breathing machine in the next room had stopped running and she could hear a nurse rushing into the hallway. Then she heard tires grinding over the gravel outside in the courtyard, more than one vehicle, followed by the quiet closing of car doors, the way people closed them when they didn't want anyone to hear. She knew at once. She went into the room and moved her husband from the bed into his wheelchair as quickly as she could. He said no. He told her to leave through the back door. She didn't answer. She pushed him down the dark hallway to the far end of the building and into the medical supply room, a room with thick walls and only one small window set high above the floor. Just inside beside the door hung the center's alarm rope, the one the old woman required every member of the staff to locate from memory on the very first day. Adeline pushed him all the way inside, then backed out and closed the door. He called her name. She said she loved him, and she locked the door from the outside. Then she walked back along the hallway toward the footsteps coming through the front entrance, and she deliberately kicked over a chair so they would hear it and move toward her. Inside the supply room, Renzo sat in the darkness and listened. He heard the footsteps change direction. He heard her say something at the other end of the hallway in a calm voice, the same voice she used when speaking to a frightened child. Then he heard her cry out. He pushed the wheelchair beside a table positioned against the wall. The rope hung about 3 ordinary steps away for a man who could walk. Renzo didn't have 3 steps. He hadn't had even 1 step in 6 years. He gripped the edge of the table with both hands, pulled himself upright, and stood. There were no braces, no parallel bars, no one counting for him. His knees trembled violently, and his entire body pitched forward, and then he walked. On the first step, his left foot came down on the cold concrete floor and held. On the second, one hand slipped from the edge of the table, and he staggered, but he didn't fall. On the third, his leg collapsed beneath him, and he went down, falling forward with one arm stretched as far as it could reach, and his hand touched the rope. He pulled it down with the full weight of his body. The center's alarm began to howl, tearing through the entire valley, and at the same moment, the battery-powered emergency lights flared to life throughout the hallways. There were footsteps running back toward the courtyard, the sound of car doors, tires screaming along the dirt road, and then sirens approaching from the road ahead. Warren's vehicles, the men who had followed Adeline there that afternoon without her knowing. It ended outside in the courtyard, beyond the sight of everyone inside that row of wooden buildings. Adeline ran down the hallway, her hands shaking so badly that she had to try twice before she could fit the key into the lock. She opened the supply room door and saw her husband lying face down on the concrete floor, the wheelchair standing alone at the far end of the room several steps away from him, while his hand still clutched the alarm rope. He was crying, not because of the pain. He cried like a man who had just been given back something he had buried with his own hands a very long time ago. He lifted his face toward her and said in a broken voice that he'd walked 3 steps. He said it again, then once more, that he'd walked 3 steps. Adeline, 3 steps. She knelt on the concrete floor beside him, slipped one hand beneath his head, and spoke the words he'd said to her on the hotel steps that day, when she'd still been the woman the entire city had been so quick to erase. She said she'd just watched a man walk into the fire and come back out of it on his own 2 feet. What kept Adeline awake during the days that followed wasn't what had happened in the hallway, but one very simple question. No one knew which weekends she traveled to Vermont. Warren knew, but Warren was the man who had sent cars to follow her that afternoon. She went back over every link in the chain: who received the mail, who accepted the medicine, who called to confirm the room, and in the end, only one person remained. Before she had the chance to ask, Delphine Boyd came to the school herself one Wednesday afternoon and waited outside the gate with her cloth bag held against her chest. The moment Adeline stepped outside, she said she'd come to tell the truth before someone else told it for her. The 2 women sat down on a stone bench in the schoolyard. Delphine said that several months earlier, someone had come to her home. They hadn't threatened her. They had simply placed a medical file on the table. It belonged to her grandson, a child waiting for a bone marrow transplant at one of the city's major hospitals, and the woman behind all of it held a seat on the board of that very hospital. Delphine said they hadn't asked her to do anything important. They had only asked which days of the month, asked about the hours, asked when the apartment would be empty. She said she'd given them the dates and times, nothing more, and she hadn't known what they intended to do with that information until the night in Vermont. She didn't cry. She sat with her back straight on the stone bench and looked across the schoolyard, then turned to Adeline and asked her one question. She said Adeline was a teacher, that she'd spent her life teaching children, so she should tell her, if it had been her, Whom would she have chosen? Adeline opened her mouth and couldn't speak. She sat there with both hands resting in her lap, unable to find a single word for the woman who had carried a pot of soup to her on the first night. She had nowhere else to go. The matter was taken to Vermont that same evening. Warren said 3 words, the old law, and nothing more, because everyone in that house knew what the old law meant. Renzo remained silent for a long time. Then he asked his wife only one question. He asked whether Delphine had lied about anything, and Adeline said no, that she'd come forward before anyone questioned her. He nodded. He told Warren to let her go home. He said the family would cover the child's hospital expenses, all of them, and if anyone on that board created difficulties, Warren was to tell him. Then he added one sentence that left Warren standing motionless for several seconds. He said this was the last time the family would forgive someone because of a name. From then on, they would forgive because of the person. Renzo still had more than a month left in the program, and he insisted on completing every day of it. He told his wife to return to Chicago, finish teaching the semester, visit her brother, and he promised that when he came home, he would walk from the car door to the front steps on his own. She left on a clear morning at the beginning of the week, with dry roads beneath her tires. It happened on the overpass leading into the city, when a tractor-trailer changed lanes just as she was passing, forcing her car toward the barrier before continuing down the road without stopping. The car she was driving was no longer the old one. After the gala, Warren had quietly replaced it with another car that was just as faded and just as ugly, but its frame had been reinforced and its windows weren't made of ordinary glass, and he'd never told her. She survived, but she lay unconscious in a private room under strict guard. That evening, the news reported an accident involving a tractor-trailer on the overpass, but mentioned only that the driver had been rushed to an undisclosed facility in critical condition. Renzo flew home that very night. He entered her hospital room on his own 2 feet, moving slowly and holding on for support, and sat beside his wife's bed throughout the night, without saying a word. In the morning, when Warren asked whether they should make a public statement, Renzo gave only one answer. He said to keep her presence a complete secret and let the world believe she was out of the picture. They needed time to gather every last piece of evidence in silence before anyone realized she was still standing. On the second night, when the machines had settled into their steady rhythm and the only other sound in the room was his wife's breathing, Renzo reached for the object the nurses had placed on the bedside cabinet beside her wallet and keys, her father's tie. He had seen it countless times in the Bridgeport apartment, always lying somewhere close to where she slept, and he'd never once picked it up. Now he held it in his hands and ran his fingers along its length until they stopped. On the inside, running along the lining, was a section of thread in a different color. It wasn't the work of a tailor. The stitches were large, widely spaced, and crooked, the kind made by a man holding a needle for the first time and using it while he was in a hurry. Renzo called Warren and told him to bring a paper knife. He cut the stitches open very slowly, and from inside the lining, a memory card, no larger than the tip of his little finger, fell into his palm. Warren brought a computer within half an hour. There were several hundred files on it. They were financial records. There were reconciliation sheets, marked accounting entries, photographs of payment vouchers, and printed emails that had been photographed again, all belonging to Whitmore and Cole from the years before the company had grown large. Adeline's father had once been the chief accountant there. He was the man who had rebuilt their bookkeeping system, and he was the one who discovered that portions of the budget allocated to public schools on the south side of the city, money for books, equipment, and children like the students his daughter would one day teach, had been siphoned away and sent elsewhere for years. One of the files contained a draft complaint addressed to the school district's inspector general, dated but never sent. That same night, the company's office had burned. The official report concluded that the fire had been caused by a short circuit in the old wiring, and her father had been the only person who remained late at work. The 2 children had been told it was an accident. But the thing that made Renzo set the computer down and sit motionless in the darkness for a very long time was the final file, an audio recording less than 1 minute long. Adeline woke on the morning of the 3rd day. She saw her husband sitting beside the bed, then saw the cut tie lying across the blanket, and she asked what he'd done to it. He didn't explain. He simply handed her the headphones. After 19 years, her father's voice sounded inside her head. He spoke quietly, like a man afraid someone might hear him, and there was the rustling of paper in the background. He said that if she was hearing this, it meant he hadn't made it home in time. He said he was sorry he hadn't taken her for ice cream that afternoon as he'd promised. He told her to take care of her brother, and reminded her that Jonah was afraid of the dark, so she had to leave the hallway light on. Then his voice slowed, and he told her to listen carefully. He said she must never accept anything from a man named Gerald Whitmore. Not money, not a home, not even a kind word. He said he loved her. Then the recording ended. Adeline removed the headphones and sat in silence. She didn't cry. In a perfectly ordinary voice, she told her husband that her father had come to collect her from school earlier than usual that afternoon, that he'd taken off his tie and handed it to her, telling her to hold it for him because he would need it the next day. She said she remembered rolling it up and pushing it into her school bag, and she'd even been annoyed because it took up the space where she kept her pencil case. She said that was the last time she ever saw him. Then she picked up the tie, turned it over in her hands, and looked at the clumsy stitching her father had sewn one afternoon when he knew he might not come home. She said she'd carried it with her for 19 years. She'd taken it through 3 moves, carried it into the bathroom with the lock on the inside on the 2nd floor of the Whitmore house, brought it to the hospital on the nights she sat waiting in the hallway, and held it in her hands when she opened the door to a hotel room on her wedding day. Then she said the one thing that made her voice falter for the first time that entire morning. She said she'd nearly sold it 3 times. Once when they ran out of money for her mother's medicine, once during the first year Jonah was in the hospital, and once not long ago, at the same second-hand shop on Halsted Street where she'd sold her wedding dress, when the clerk picked it up, turned it over several times, then handed it back and said they didn't accept silk that old. She said that for 19 years, her father had been speaking one sentence to her, and she'd been holding that sentence in her hands without ever hearing it. The Castellano family's great house stood on the northwest side of the city, and its doors hadn't been opened to guests since the funeral of Renzo's father. This time, they were opened. There were no invitations, and no public announcement, only a brief line on the Charitable Foundation's news page, saying that the family would hold a small memorial on Sunday afternoon, and that relatives wishing to offer their condolences should make contact in advance. Renzo remained in a room at the back of the house, and he didn't correct a single word anyone believed. The Whitmores were brought into the house under the pretense of a private settlement meeting arranged by Renzo's trusted men. Gerald wore a dark suit. Deborah wore dark glasses and carried a handkerchief, and Camille walked between them. All 3 sets of mourning clothes were brand new, their store creases still sharp. Trevor Blake followed several steps behind. They were shown into the great drawing room and offered water, and Gerald had been seated for less than 5 minutes before he began speaking about legal documents. He said that despite the unfortunate events that had taken place within the family, he was still, in the eyes of the law, the guardian who had raised Adeline under his name since she was a child, that the marriage had been far too brief, that there certainly couldn't have been a will, and that his attorney believed whatever property the Castellano family had transferred to her would have to return to her relatives. Deborah nodded and said, "My poor child." Camille sat silently with both hands resting in her lap. Then the drawing room door opened. Adeline walked in, her temple still bandaged, calm and composed. She moved slowly, but she walked without help. Deborah gave a cry and covered her mouth. Gerald sprang to his feet so suddenly that he knocked over the glass of water on the table. Camille didn't move, and that was the only detail Renzo, sitting in the corner of the room, fixed in his mind. Adeline didn't shout. She didn't accuse anyone. She walked to the low table in the middle of the room, placed a small audio player upon it, and pressed the button. Her father's voice filled the drawing room of a house he had never once entered. Everyone listened to that recording of less than a minute, all the way to the moment when he warned her never to accept anything from a man named Gerald Whitmore, and when his voice faded, no one spoke. Adeline then placed the printed files on the table. She said her father had built the accounting system for the company, that he had discovered money intended for public schools on the South Side had been siphoned away for years, and that he had written a complaint but hadn't lived long enough to send it. Then she revealed the final truth, and she did so in the calmest voice she had used all afternoon. She said adopting 2 orphan children hadn't been an act of kindness. It had been the fastest way to close an investigation, because no one would suspect the man who had taken in the children of the dead. Gerald began to speak, loudly, saying it was slander and that he would sue. In the middle of his sentence, Deborah collapsed back into her chair. She removed her dark glasses. There were no tears on her face, only the expression of someone who had finally released something she had held for too long, until her hands had lost all feeling. She said, "I can't bear this anymore." Then she began to talk. She spoke about the night 7 years earlier, the night of the incident that had left Jonah in the hospital. She said the vehicle involved had been registered to her family. She said the person behind the wheel that night had driven away and returned home. And she had been the one who opened the door. She said her husband had paid to blur a single line in the report, only one line, and from the following day onward, no one had asked another question. She said that for 7 years, she had eaten at the same table with 2 daughters, while one child lay on the west side of the city unable to speak, and the other sat inside their home eating the finest portion of every meal, and she had remained silent. She turned toward Camille and said, "I'm sorry, my child, but I can't carry this into the grave." Camille stood. She said her mother had gone mad. She said it 3 times, each time louder than before, and no one in the room answered her. Adeline didn't look at her. She looked down at her own hands for a moment, then raised her head and asked her adoptive sister only one question. She asked whether, during all those 7 years, on the evenings when Adeline cooked for her, on the days when she saved the meat for Camille because Camille said she was hungry, she had ever once thought about the boy lying on the west side of the city. Camille couldn't answer. Gerald was arrested that same evening before his car had even passed through the gates. Trevor remained standing in the drawing room, and Warren handed him a sheet of paper and a pen. The document stated that he would repay every cent he had taken from Jonah's care fund, in installments, for the rest of his life. He looked at the paper. He looked at the pen. He didn't take it. Bruno didn't wait long. Believing Adeline was permanently incapacitated, and that his nephew was broken and isolated in Vermont, he moved swiftly. For 2 days, he went from house to house, convincing the other families that Renzo's household had completely collapsed, that his wife was out of the picture, and that an empty chair must be filled. This time, he had enough support. 3 of the 4 families nodded their agreement. The vote was scheduled for Thursday evening at the same restaurant in Cicero that had closed for the winter, and the tables and chairs were arranged exactly as they had been before, except that this time no space had been left for the Castellanos. Bruno sat there instead. He had spoken only a few sentences about family honor and the need for someone to step forward and bear the burden. When the wooden door opened and Adeline walked in, she came alone. No lawyer, no letter of authorization, no one at her side. In her hands, she carried only a small audio player and 3 envelopes. Bruno laughed and asked who had allowed this woman inside. Then he told the room that this was the very thing his nephew had dragged home. A public school teacher whose own adoptive parents had thrown her into the street in the middle of her wedding. A girl of uncertain origins who knew when to kneel and how to climb into the bed of a crippled man. No one laughed with him. Adeline placed the 3 envelopes on the table and pushed them in 3 different directions. She said that during the previous weeks, she'd visited their homes, one by one, in broad daylight, and she'd brought no money and spoken no threat. She said she'd simply done what she did for a living, placed the truth on the table and allowed people to read it for themselves. The 3 men opened the envelopes. Inside were dates, names, and records of meetings held in places none of them had ever mentioned to anyone outside their circles. The old man from the Western family read halfway down the page, then lowered it and looked directly at Bruno. Adeline continued in the same voice she used in her classroom. She said the man sitting in that chair had sold their information in exchange for his own safety, that he'd been selling it since before the night on the overpass, and that if they voted for him that evening, they would be handing the keys to their homes to the man who had already given their addresses to someone else. Bruno stood. He no longer pretended. He cursed her with words no one in that room would ever repeat afterward, and he said that for 30 years he'd carried that family name on his back, while his older brother had been allowed to stand before everyone and receive all the honor. He said he had always been the smartest man in the house and the most invisible, and that tonight he would sit in the chair that should have belonged to him long ago. Then the wooden door opened for a second time. Renzo walked in on his own 2 feet. He moved slowly, supporting himself with a wooden cane in his right hand, and every one of his steps sounded clearly against the floorboards in that silence. No one in the room said a single word about those legs. Neither did he. He walked to the head of the table, stood there, and didn't sit down. He placed a recording device on the table, turned the ring on his little finger exactly twice, and pressed the button. It was a recording of a meeting from 6 years earlier. Bruno's voice could be heard clearly and calmly, instructing someone to make it look like an accident, followed by another man's voice, the mechanic's, asking him to confirm which day it was to be done and who would drive the car out of the garage. The recording lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, the old man from the Western family was the first to rise, and he didn't look at Bruno. They escorted Bruno from the room without laying a harsh hand on him, and when he reached the door, he turned back. He laughed. He asked his nephew whether he truly believed he'd won. He said he had only been the hand holding the knife, while the man who had paid for that knife was still dining in the Gold Coast that very night. And Bruno himself had never once been invited to sit at that table. Then he left. After the room had emptied and only a few people remained, Rosaria Castellano, who had sat in a corner throughout the evening without speaking once, rose with the help of her cane and walked toward Adeline. She said she owed her a story. She said that 6 years earlier, while her grandson still lay in intensive care and no one knew whether he would ever wake, she'd hired people to find the girl who had pulled him from the burning car that night, and she'd found Adeline long ago, before even her grandson had found her. She said she'd also known the car hadn't failed on its own, because the mechanic had come to her before he disappeared, and he'd told her only one thing, that if she opened her mouth, the boy would be next. She said she'd remained silent for 6 years, not because of the family name, but because she had only one grandson. Then she looked at Adeline for a very long time and said that on the evening of the gala, every cruel word she'd spoken before the entire city had been deliberate. She said she'd needed all of them to believe the Castellano family had rejected Adeline, because that was the only armor an old woman like her still had enough strength to place around her. Renzo sent 30 people to search for that name. They combed through the guest lists of restaurants in the Gold Coast, searched the records of charitable foundations, and even examined the parties where Bruno had once been invited to sit at the last table, and after 3 weeks, they brought him a thick stack of papers without a single name that held up under scrutiny. Adeline found it on a Tuesday afternoon during the break between classes, when she passed through the teacher's lounge to get some chalk. She stopped before the donor list hanging on the wall, the faded board she'd walked past every morning for 4 years without ever reading. For the first time in her life, she read it from top to bottom. The name was in the 3rd row, Marguerite Pell. From there, everything arranged itself into place. Her husband had once conducted business on the west side of the city, and had been blocked by Renzo's father in an affair where both sides suffered losses. Then the man died of illness, leaving her behind with his money and a ledger of debts no one knew she was keeping. She was the purse. 6 years earlier, she had been the one who paid to buy Bruno, and in recent years, she had continued funneling money through Trevor, the man who served as the bridge. That was also why a man who had gone bankrupt always seemed to have money in his pocket, and it was the path those funds had followed into Camille's hands. The invitation arrived 3 days later. A brief message, saying that Marguerite had information about the overpass incident that the police didn't possess, and asking Adeline to meet her in a hotel room overlooking the lake that Marguerite herself had reserved. Adeline went alone. She wore the same clothes she wore to teach. Mrs. Pell poured tea for her, asked about the wound on her temple, praised her courage, and said she was terribly sorry she'd had to write a message that wasn't true. Then she said plainly that several men would arrive shortly, that there would be documents to sign and photographs to take, photographs that Adeline would remember whenever she considered opening her mouth in the future. Adeline didn't rise. She lifted her teacup and began asking the questions a teacher asks when the child before her has already placed himself somewhere from which there is no retreat. She asked when it had begun. She asked who had approached Bruno first. She asked through whose hands the money had passed. Mrs. Pell answered. She spoke for nearly half an hour, in an unhurried voice, occasionally laughing, because she'd never had anyone in her life to whom she could tell this story, and because she believed the woman sitting before her wouldn't leave that room as the same person who had entered it. She told her everything. Adeline's phone had been lying face down on the table since the beginning, its screen dark, while the connection on the other end remained open. Someone knocked on the door before Marguerite's men could arrive. Marguerite Pell and Trevor Blake were arrested on the same evening, less than an hour apart. Several weeks later, on an afternoon as ordinary as any other, Adeline and Renzo went to the care center on the west side of the city. For months, Jonah had been enrolled in a different program, with someone coming every day to work with him, and Renzo had been the one who signed the papers, though he'd never said a word about it. That afternoon, he stood beside the bed, with one hand resting on his cane, struggling to pull the blanket straight. Jonah looked at him. Then he made a sound. It was hoarse and misshapen, the first sound to leave his mouth in 7 years. He called to him. Adeline stood frozen at the foot of the bed. The nurse dropped the tray. And Renzo, the man who had stood without blinking in a room filled with the most powerful people in the region, turned his face toward the window, and remained there for a very long time, one hand still gripping his cane, until no one could see his face anymore. Adeline went to see Camille only once, on a Friday morning, in a visitation room, where the tables and chairs were bolted to the floor. Camille sat down first, her fingers woven together, and the moment she saw her sister, she began to speak, saying that people had used her, that nothing was as simple as they made it sound, that her mother had lied. Adeline allowed her to finish. She didn't ask why. She didn't make a single accusation. Then she stood, and before turning toward the door, she said only one thing to her adoptive sister, that she'd come so Camille would know she wasn't angry anymore, and also so she would know that this was the last time she would ever see her. Adeline walked out, and she didn't look back. Their second wedding took place on a Saturday morning at the beginning of summer, in broad daylight, in the courtyard of the school where Adeline still went to teach every Monday morning. There was no red carpet, no reporters, and no grand names announced for the sake of importance. Her students stood in 2 rows along the gravel path, holding baskets of flowers cut from the school custodian's garden, and they scattered them the way children always scattered flowers, which meant one child dropped each petal carefully, another turned the entire basket upside down and laughed until breathless, and Micah stood at the front of the line, raising his hand to wave and calling her name so clearly that the whole courtyard burst into applause. Adeline pushed her brother's wheelchair in first, brought him to the front row, straightened his collar, then went back and walked by herself between the 2 lines of children. Rosaria Castellano sat in the first row on the other side, leaning on her cane, her back still straight. Delphine Boyd sat beside her, and she was there because her grandson had safely made it through the transplant at the beginning of spring and had now returned home. Warren stood at the far end of the courtyard, and throughout the entire ceremony, he never took his eyes from the school gate, because the habits of a lifetime couldn't be abandoned. Renzo stood waiting at the end of the path, his right hand resting on a cane, and he remained on his feet throughout the whole ceremony, without sitting down even once. When the music began, he held out his hand to his wife. He danced slowly, very slowly, the cane still in his right hand, and his left hand resting against her back. Each time he shifted his weight onto his left leg, his jaw tightened slightly. But he didn't stop. He had promised her this in a ground-floor apartment overlooking an unlit alley, back when they were both counting every last dollar, and he kept his word. That autumn, a scholarship fund bearing the names of her parents was established for students attending public schools on the south side of the city, providing scholarships as well as the assistive equipment those schools had always been forced to beg for. Adeline didn't stop teaching. On the Monday morning after the wedding, she was still in her classroom before the bell rang. Deborah Whitmore was taken to a charitable center in the suburbs, where she was given a room and real work, cleaning and cooking for people who had no one left. Adeline told her that this was the inheritance she was returning, so Deborah could learn what Adeline had learned at her feet from the age of 8, that even when a person was small and unseen by everyone, that person was still human. This story leaves us with 3 very simple truths. A person's worth doesn't lie in the possessions they own or in the legs that carry them, but in the way they treat others when no one is watching. Blood doesn't make a family. Kindness does. And sometimes the person who stays beside us is the greatest stranger of all. And forgiveness doesn't mean going back, because releasing resentment is meant to lighten our hearts, not to reopen a door that once made us bleed. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with the people you love. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that every day you can join us in listening to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about Adeline and Renzo? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish every one of you listening abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in each passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.